It is just after midnight in the South Atlantic, early May 1982. On the Falkland Islands, recently seized by Argentine forces, the war still feels abstract. The soldiers manning checkpoints and listening posts are cold, tired, and tense, but confident. The geography itself feels like protection. Between the islands and the British mainland lies almost 4,000 miles of open ocean. No hostile air force can simply cross that distance, strike, and return. Every known performance table, every flight manual, every operational doctrine agrees on that point. Distance is safety. Inside the Argentine air defense network, that assumption is baked into every plan. The islands are covered by ground-based surveillance radars, including mobile systems originally designed for Cold War air defense against high-altitude bombers. Operators monitor their scopes for expected threats. Low-flying Sea Harriers launched from British carriers, or maritime patrol aircraft skirting the edge of coverage. The radar picture is familiar and orderly. Blips appear where physics says they should. Anything else is treated as clutter, interference, or weather. Strategically, Argentina's leadership believes the air war will be local and constrained. British aircraft carriers are known to be operating far to the east, outside the densest defensive zones. Carrier aviation has range limits. Even with aerial refueling, short-legged tactical fighters cannot sustain deep strikes without exposing the fleet. Heavy bombers, the kind that once defined strategic air power, are considered irrelevant. Britain retired its long-range bomber force from frontline nuclear duty years earlier. The Avro Vulcan, if it still exists at all, belongs to museums, not combat plans. That belief shapes everything. Argentine Mirage 3 interceptors are held back on the mainland to protect population centers. Air defenses on the islands are configured to defeat low-altitude, fast-moving threats, not solitary aircraft approaching from extreme range at altitude. The Atlantic itself is treated as a natural barrier more reliable than any missile system. The war, as calculated on paper, has limits. And then the logic begins to fail. Radar operators notice something strange near the edge of detection range. Not a formation, not a predictable track. A fleeting contact, high and fast, appearing where no aircraft should be. The return is intermittent, fading in and out as if testing the system. At first, it is dismissed. Atmospheric conditions over the South Atlantic are notoriously unstable, and electronic noise is common. Filters are adjusted. Gain is recalibrated. The screen clears, and for a moment, the anomaly is gone. What no one yet understands is that the assumptions underlying the entire defensive picture are about to collapse. An aircraft is approaching that should not exist in this theater, flying a mission that should not be possible under any conventional interpretation of range, fuel capacity, or doctrine. The radar picture is not wrong. The math is. The contact does not announce itself with drama. There is no sudden alarm, no clear declaration of an incoming strike. Instead, the warning arrives in fragments. A faint return at altitude, briefly visible before dissolving into static. Operators replay recent sweeps, comparing notes, questioning equipment calibration. The altitude estimate is wrong for a fighter. The speed does not match a transport. The track is inconsistent, as if the aircraft is deliberately skirting the edge of detection. That alone is unsettling. Argentine planners expect British aircraft to operate near the islands or from the sea, not from the deep southern approaches where radar coverage thins and reaction time disappears. Minutes later, the sound arrives before visual confirmation. A low, rolling thunder that does not resemble jet fighters or turboprops. It is deeper, heavier, carrying through the air with a physical presence that rattles structures and nerves. This is not the acoustic signature Argentine forces are trained to recognize. It is the sound of engines designed for a different era and a different kind of war. By the time anti-aircraft crews begin scanning the sky, the first explosions are already unfolding. A series of detonations walks across the airfield in a deliberate line, tearing through soil and asphalt. The attack is not precise in the modern sense, but it is unmistakably strategic. One of the bombs strikes the runway squarely, blowing a crater large enough to render it unusable for fast jet operations. Others scatter debris, damage infrastructure, and send shockwaves through command buildings and radar stations. Inside the air defense network, confusion turns into disbelief. The pattern of destruction suggests a heavy bomber delivering a conventional bomb load from altitude. That conclusion clashes violently with every prior assumption. Britain is not supposed to have a bomber capable of reaching the islands. Even if such an aircraft existed, the distance from the nearest British base makes a round-trip mission seem absurd. There is no friendly airfield closer than Ascension Island, nearly 4,000 miles to the north. No aircraft in the Argentine order of battle, nor any listed in British public inventories, should be able to fly that distance, attack, and escape. The radar picture offers only partial answers. Electronic interference briefly floods key frequencies, obscuring tracks at critical moments. By the time operators regain clarity, the contact is already receding, fading back into the vastness of the Atlantic. Interceptor aircraft are placed on alert, but no clear vector exists. There is nothing to chase. As daylight approaches, the scale of what has happened begins to settle in. The physical damage is real, but the deeper effect is psychological. If an aircraft can appear from beyond the limits of accepted range and strike without warning, the Atlantic is no longer a shield. It is a corridor, and the rules governing this war have just changed. In Buenos Aires, the first reports arrive stripped of context and heavy with uncertainty. Runway damaged. Bombs delivered from altitude. Aircraft type unknown. Command staff spread maps across tables and begin working through the numbers. Range calculations come first because range defines possibility. From Ascension Island to the Falklands and back is roughly 8,000 miles round trip. Fuel burn rates for any known bomber platform make that figure laughable. Even with aerial refueling, the margins would be impossibly thin. Midair refueling itself is treated as a supporting tool, not a foundation for an entire strike plan. No modern doctrine relies on repeated tanker hookups across hostile ocean with no alternate landing fields. Yet the evidence cannot be dismissed. Ground observers describe a large aircraft, high overhead, producing an engine noise unlike fighters or transports. The bomb pattern confirms a conventional gravity-delivered strike, not sabotage or missile attack. The crater on the runway is photographed, measured, and verified. Whatever flew over the islands was real, heavy, and crude. Attention turns to British capabilities. The Vulcan bomber still exists within the Royal Air Force inventory, officially relegated to secondary roles after Britain shifted its nuclear deterrent to submarines. The aircraft is old, first flown in the early 1950s, and designed around a doctrine that assumed apocalyptic war rather than limited regional conflict. On paper, its unrefueled combat radius is roughly 2,000 miles, well short of what this mission would require. If a Vulcan was involved, it would have needed extraordinary tanker support, careful navigation, and a tolerance for risk far outside peacetime norms. That realization reframes the event. This was not a demonstration of effortless technological superiority. It was an act of calculated audacity. The British were not bending physics. They were stacking logistics, manpower, and luck into a fragile structure that could collapse at any point. To make the mission work, planners would have needed multiple tanker aircraft refueling each other in sequence, a cascading chain where failure at any link would doom the aircraft at the end of it. Such a plan would be complex, vulnerable, and invisible on most radar systems, especially if executed under strict radio silence. For Argentine commanders, this introduces a new and deeply uncomfortable variable. If Britain is willing to gamble crews, aircraft, and strategic assets on such missions, then traditional deterrents lose meaning. The expected limits of enemy behavior no longer apply. The strike on the airfield may have caused limited physical damage, but it forces a reassessment of priorities. Fighter aircraft intended for offensive operations are now needed closer to home. Radar operators begin watching not just the horizon, but the emptiness beyond it, aware that the next threat may again emerge from where doctrine says nothing should exist. While Argentine planners work backward from the crater, British planners are confronting a very different reality. The mission that produced the strike was not clean or elegant. It was a compromise layered on top of improvisation, built around aircraft never intended to perform conventional bombing at intercontinental range. The Vulcan force had been declining for years, maintained largely for contingency roles rather than sustained operations. Converting it into a viable strike platform required reopening systems that had been effectively mothballed, including air-to-air refueling hardware that had not been used operationally in years. Navigation alone posed a serious challenge. In 1982, satellite navigation does not exist in a form usable by tactical aircraft. Long-range accuracy depends on inertial navigation systems that drift over time, especially on flights lasting more than 10 hours. Even minor errors accumulate into miles of uncertainty. Missing the islands altogether is a real possibility, not a theoretical one. Correcting that drift requires either external fixes or visual confirmation, neither of which is guaranteed over the South Atlantic. The margin for error is narrow, and the consequences of miscalculation are fatal. Fuel planning is even less forgiving. The Vulcan's consumption rate under load leaves no room for inefficiency. To deliver one bomber to the target, multiple Victor tanker aircraft must operate in a carefully timed sequence. Tankers refuel the bomber, then other tankers refuel those tankers, extending the range step by step across thousands of miles. Each rendezvous requires precise timing, stable flight conditions, and functioning refueling equipment. A single failed hose, pump, or connection forces the entire plan to unravel. There are no divert fields along the route, no search and rescue safety net waiting below. Electronic warfare becomes the final layer of protection. Argentine radar coverage, while limited in depth, is capable of detecting large aircraft at altitude. To survive the approach and escape, the bomber must rely on electronic countermeasures designed for different platforms and threats. These systems are adapted, tested under pressure, and fielded with limited assurance they will function as intended against unfamiliar radar configurations. Their success is not guaranteed. It is hoped for. Understanding this changes the meaning of the strike. The Vulcan's appearance over the Falklands is not proof of limitless British reach. It is evidence of a willingness to accept extraordinary risk to achieve a strategic effect. The attack is designed less to destroy infrastructure than to destabilize assumptions. For the Argentines, the sudden collapse of those assumptions is as damaging as the bombs themselves. The impact of the strike ripples outward long after the smoke clears. On the islands, repair crews work quickly to restore limited runway functionality, enough to support transport aircraft and basic operations. From a purely material standpoint, the damage is contained and manageable. But wars are not decided solely by engineering assessments. They are shaped by perception, fear, and the allocation of scarce resources. In that domain, the bomber's appearance achieves far more than the physical destruction suggests. Argentine air commanders now face a dilemma they had not planned for. If Britain can strike from extreme range once, it may be able to do it again. There is no way to know how many bombers are available, how sustainable the effort is, or whether future targets might include mainland air bases, fuel depots, or command centers. Defensive priorities shift almost immediately. Mirage 3 interceptors that had been positioned to contest airspace over the islands are pulled back toward the mainland to guard against a potential follow-on attack. Radar coverage is reoriented. Patrol patterns are altered. Aircraft that could have threatened British naval forces are reassigned to homeland defense. This redistribution weakens Argentina's forward posture at a critical moment. When British naval aviation begins sustained operations around the islands, resistance in the air is thinner than it otherwise might have been. The bomber has not destroyed squadrons or ships, but it has influenced how the opposing air force fights. That is the essence of the mission's success. The Vulcan does not dominate the battle space through repeated strikes. It changes the geometry of the conflict with a single, improbable appearance. For radar operators and air defense crews, the psychological effect lingers. False contacts are taken more seriously. Anomalies are no longer dismissed. Missiles are wasted on uncertain tracks. The sense of predictability that once governed watch routines is gone. Every sweep of the radar carries the possibility that the impossible might return. This is not accidental. Strategic air power, even in limited form, has always traded as much on threat as on execution. By demonstrating that distance is negotiable and doctrine can be bent, the bomber forces the enemy to defend everywhere at once. That burden is unsustainable over time. The mission's true legacy lies here, in the silent reallocation of assets and attention. A single aircraft, operating at the edge of feasibility, has compelled a larger force to fight with caution instead of confidence. The crater on the runway will be filled. The fear it created will not be so easily erased. The bomber never returns. No second strike follows, no visible campaign of long-range attacks. From a distance, that absence could be mistaken for restraint or limitation. In reality, the work has already been done. The mission's value was never measured in craters alone. It lay in proof. Proof that assumptions could be shattered. Proof that doctrine, however carefully constructed, could fail under pressure from ingenuity and risk tolerance. For the British, the raid becomes a quiet reference point rather than a public triumph. It is understood internally as a near failure that succeeded by inches, timing, and individual decisions made in isolated cockpits over an empty ocean. It is not a model easily repeated, nor one that would survive routine use. But war rarely requires repetition when a single demonstration is enough. For Argentina, the lesson cuts deeper. The war had been framed as geographically contained, bounded by distance and logistics. After the strike, those boundaries feel artificial. The air defense picture no longer ends at the horizon. Every calculation must now account for what is theoretically possible, not merely what is likely. That shift in mindset persists well beyond the repair of a runway or the redeployment of aircraft. In the broader history of air power, the mission occupies an unusual place. It does not herald a new weapon system or doctrine. Instead, it exposes the enduring power of long-range strike as a psychological instrument. Even aging platforms, when paired with planning, logistics, and resolve, can exert influence far out of proportion to their numbers. The Vulcan's flight reminds military planners of an uncomfortable truth. Technology defines limits, but people decide how close to those limits they are willing to fly. And sometimes that willingness is enough to change the course of a campaign. If you want more deep dives into Cold War operations, military technology, and the moments where doctrine collided with reality, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us.